The humid air clung to every exposed inch of skin, thick with the smell of wet earth, diesel, and the faint tang of sweat-soaked canvas. A distant thrum of artillery rattled the jungle canopy, punctuating the uneasy silence that had settled over the Allied encampment. The Western soldiers had grown accustomed to discomfort, but nothing had prepared them for the sight that greeted them at the edge of their shared mess area. Across the low fire pit, their coalition partners moved with a casual efficiency that made the stomach tighten in both disbelief and instinctive revulsion. With deliberate precision, they dismembered a small, scaly creature, a monitor lizard, its tail curling like a living whip even as it was tossed into the sizzling fat of a makeshift pan. Others picked through a scattering of foraged roots and insects, the crunch of exoskeletons mingling with the hiss of oil and the occasional grunt of satisfaction. The aroma hit first, a raw metallic undertone that clawed at the nose, followed by the sight of fingers caked in soil and blood, scooping hunks of protein into mouths without hesitation. The Western soldiers froze. Forks hovered midair, canteens paused at lips, and eyes darted from one horror to another. Someone muttered, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, "They're eating it raw." Another shook his head, gagging slightly at the scent of roasting flesh that had never crossed the threshold of their military rations handbook. It wasn't just a meal. It was a doctrine, a philosophy, a challenge to every unwritten rule of what civilized armies were supposed to consume. Their carefully packaged tins of powdered eggs and salted meat, symbols of discipline and preparation, suddenly felt inadequate, fragile, almost childlike in the face of this raw communion with the land. The scene escalated in quiet tension. One Western corporal, trying to mask his horror, laughed nervously, offering a ration bar as though to bridge an invisible gap. The gesture went unnoticed. The coalition soldiers were not starving. Their eyes held a subtle glint of amusement and faint superiority. They had a system, a code. To them, the forest was not a hostile backdrop, but a larder, an ecosystem to be interpreted and consumed, transformed into sustenance on demand. Every insect crushed between their teeth, every snake filleted along the campfire's edge, spoke of training, observation, and a rigor that bordered on ritual. They weren't improvising. They were executing a doctrine that had been honed, tested, and taught. The psychological recall was immediate. Western soldiers began shifting uncomfortably on their haunches, fumbling with canteens, convincing themselves that hunger, or even curiosity, would never erode the barrier between them and this unfamiliar practice. The camaraderie that had been built over months of shared patrols, firefights, and late-night vigils cracked like dry bamboo. Casual jokes fell flat, and the unspoken bond of mutual reliance wavered. Here, in the crucible of heat, sweat, and the smell of scorched earth, a subtle but undeniable hierarchy revealed itself. Those who could not embrace the land on its own terms were outsiders, spectators to an intimacy with survival they could barely comprehend. And yet fascination lingered. Soldiers watched as deft hands worked through creatures that should have triggered revulsion, noting the precision of movement, the speed of preparation, the discipline that allowed calm deliberation under duress. One Australian observer, scribbling in a small field notebook, remarked quietly about efficiency and energy retention. Others noticed the economy of waste. Nothing edible went unused, and nothing was left to spoil. The Western troops began to sense that this practice was more than eccentricity. It was operational intelligence embedded in dietary philosophy. Every meal was a rehearsal for survival under extreme conditions, a silent lesson in resilience and adaptability that conventional rations could never teach. By nightfall, the firelight threw long, flickering shadows across the faces of soldiers grappling with disgust and curiosity in equal measure. The scent of cooked roots, roasted lizard, and fried insects lingered in their nostrils, mixing with the metallic tang of sweat and the ever-present jungle humidity. Whispers circulated around the encampment, questions half-formed, almost daring one another to ask why they preferred the forest's offerings over tins and packets. No one had an answer, yet everyone felt the weight of the unspoken lesson. This was not desperation. Starvation was absent, their bellies were full, their training intact. What they faced was a philosophy of survival that elevated self-reliance, environmental attunement, and tactical advantage into a tangible practice. By turning the land into a pantry and themselves into predators attuned to every sound, smell, and movement, these soldiers achieved something beyond nourishment. They achieved mobility, stealth, and resilience in a theater where every advantage mattered. The Western soldiers, trapped in the narrow framework of conventional military provisioning, could only watch in horrified admiration, their understanding limited to instinctive revulsion and a grudging acknowledgement of effectiveness. By dawn, the camp settled into an uneasy routine. The smell of cooking had faded to residual smoke, but the lesson remained, haunting in its clarity. What had begun as a simple observation, a meal, had become a window into a survival doctrine that defied Western preconceptions, challenged cultural norms, and silently asserted superiority on the field of operations. The story of that meal, of the insects and lizards and foraged roots, would linger long after the rations had been eaten, a symbol of a philosophy that could not be ignored. To thrive in the jungle, one must embrace it utterly, even when it shatters the conventions of taste, civility, and the camaraderie that soldiers hold dear. By the end of the first week, it was clear to all who observed, the doctrine of eating the land was not merely about sustenance. It was about dominance, adaptability, and a psychological edge that would ripple through every patrol, ambush, and engagement that followed. And for the Western soldiers, the memory of that first meal would linger like smoke in the lungs, unforgettable, disquieting, and deeply instructive, a mystery that demanded understanding before any alliance could truly endure. The first lesson of self-sufficiency begins in the smell of smoke and sweat, in the oppressive heat of a valley where the air itself seems to weigh on every breath. Centuries of conflict had taught certain armies a singular truth. Hunger could be engineered, deprivation exploited, and the land itself transformed into both sanctuary and weapon. In the humid jungles of Vietnam, the Viet Cong moved like ghosts through paddy fields and mangrove swamps, carrying nothing they could not forage, consuming rice they grew themselves, fish trapped in mud-laden canals, and roots pulled from the damp soil. They were never entirely dependent on distant depots or armored convoys. Their logistics were invisible because they had none. Their survival was a dance with the land itself, one that made every inch of terrain a partner and every harvest a shield. While Western armies calculated supply tonnage and ration counts down to the last gram, these fighters carried only their ingenuity, a handful of tools, and a relentless understanding of microenvironments. This doctrine was not born of comfort. It was the necessity imposed by isolation and sustained conflict. In Korea's jagged highlands, partisans taught identical lessons, though beneath a frost-bitten sky instead of the monsoon canopy. Their caches were concealed under layers of snow and rock, their footprints erased by wind and avalanche. Soldiers could go days without resupply, living off stored grains and small game, moving silently through villages whose inhabitants had long internalized the rhythm of insurgent movement. Here, too, supply lines were liabilities. Western-style armies, accustomed to vast columns of trucks, artillery, and preserved rations, could be frozen in place if a single bridge was destroyed, a convoy delayed, or a winter storm disrupted the line. A force that needed nothing from outside, in contrast, became untouchable, not through armor or firepower, but through absence and integration with the land. The Japanese, during isolated garrison campaigns in the Pacific, practiced similar philosophy. Outposts scattered across remote islands were forced to subsist entirely on what could be cultivated, trapped, or fished within sight of the sand and surf. Every meal consumed was a tactical decision. Every stored barrel or hidden garden was a hedge against isolation. Soldiers who had mastered this form of subsistence were no longer prisoners of supply. They could remain in place indefinitely, forcing the enemy to either adapt or starve. Western doctrine, by contrast, revolved around the predictability of supply. Morale, it was assumed, could be measured in tins of preserved meat, fresh bread when available, and the psychological comfort of rations delivered on schedule. Deviation from this system produced panic. Soldiers trained in industrial logistics feared the unknown, the absent truck, the delayed drop, the empty ration box, as much as enemy fire itself. It is here, in contrast, that the philosophical divergence becomes stark. Western militaries built empires on the faith that armies are instruments of transportable power. Everything depends on chains of provision, on moving food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies across hundreds of kilometers. A disruption in any link could produce cascading failures. A lost bridge or a destroyed depot might halt an entire corps. Guerrilla and partisan forces inverted this assumption. To them, dependency was a weakness. To survive, to endure. To project power in hostile territory, soldiers had to consume the land, integrate themselves into it, and manipulate its resources in ways invisible to the enemy. This was not mere survival, it was strategic leverage. Every vegetable patch, every snare set for fish, every river stocked with protein became a tool in a larger psychological calculus. The enemy could control territory, drop supplies, and plan logistics, yet they could never control what the self-sufficient force consumed, where it moved, or how it endured. The psychological weight of this approach was immense. Consider the Western soldier, trained to expect food as a right and comfort as a shield, marching into a jungle or mountain where every bite must be won through skill or observation. Hunger becomes more than a physical sensation. It is a constant tactical signal, a reminder of fragility and dependence. The self-sufficient soldier, in contrast, internalizes the land as an ally, transforming scarcity into confidence. The Viet Cong did not merely tolerate local staples, they weaponized them. Each enemy supply line intercepted, each abandoned depot ignored, became a lesson in futility for the opposing force. Armies that depended on precise logistics found themselves unnerved, as if the terrain itself had joined the combat. A unit without access to rations quickly becomes hesitant, cautious, second-guessing every movement. Fear does not arise from gunfire alone. It grows from the gnawing certainty that every step, every meal, every hour is under control of an adversary who answers to nothing but the earth beneath their feet. Soviet partisans in the occupied territories of World War II had perfected a similar calculus. Forests and rivers became living maps, with hidden caches of bread, salted fish, or small livestock providing both nourishment and a tactical margin. They moved in small cells, understanding that fewer mouths to feed meant longer endurance. To the enemy, this was infuriating. Conventional doctrine expected engagement to be predictable, supply lines to dictate movement, and attrition to weaken forces. Self-sufficient troops appended this logic. By embedding themselves in terrain and subsisting entirely on its provisions, they became unknowable variables. Artillery bombardments could not destroy their food stores, blockades were meaningless, starvation was deferred indefinitely. The broader implication of this philosophy, rarely articulated in Western manuals, was a radical redefinition of power. Victory was no longer measured by the number of troops or tonnage of rations moved, but by the ability to render the opponent psychologically dependent, exhausted, and uncertain. The more an army relied on externally delivered sustenance, the more it was tethered to predictable patterns, and the more vulnerable it became to forces that had mastered independence. Self-sufficiency was not a defensive posture, it was offensive. It imposed doubt, forced hesitation, and created openings the enemy could not anticipate. In jungles, mountains, or snow-laden valleys, the absence of dependence translated directly into the presence of control. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation lies in the deliberate nature of this approach. Guerrilla forces did not merely survive under austere conditions, they leveraged self-sufficiency as a weapon. By consuming what the land provided and rejecting external logistics, they induced stress and attrition without firing a single shot. Supply-dependent armies, confronted with missing rations, deteriorating morale, and an opponent who moved without need, often faltered in planning, made mistakes in engagement, or avoided the area altogether. Self-sufficiency was tactical patience made visible, a slow, gnawing pressure that redefined engagement before any bullets flew. It was a doctrine that turned the very act of eating, of moving, of sustaining life, into a form of psychological warfare. This philosophical split, the self-sufficient, terrain-integrated soldier versus the logistics-dependent, supply-focused force, reshapes the way we understand jungle and mountain warfare. Where Western doctrine sees control in supply convoys and established bases, guerrilla philosophy sees power in autonomy and adaptation. Every meal gathered from the earth, every root dug from mud, every fish netted from a river becomes a node of influence. The enemy's reliance on industrialized logistics amplifies their vulnerability. The more they depend, the more they can be manipulated. It is subtle, invisible, yet profoundly lethal. It is doctrine transformed into survival instinct, weaponized into strategic leverage. When Australian special forces later entered theaters of Southeast Asia, this lesson had already been etched into history by countless others who had lived it before. The smallest, most disciplined unit could exert outsized influence not through sheer firepower, but by understanding supply as vulnerability and sustenance as sovereignty. To master the jungle was not only to move and shoot, it was to consume, endure, and endure again. To exist independently was to project a silent dominance that logistical empires could neither anticipate nor counter. The enemy did not simply lose engagements, they faltered in expectation, weakened in confidence, and sometimes withdrew entirely before contact could occur. Self-sufficiency, in this light, became a doctrine, a philosophy, and ultimately a weapon capable of reshaping the battlefield from the ground up. The irony, unspoken yet undeniable, is that this principle, so alien to Western thinking, so counterintuitive to officers trained in supply tables and ration counts, transformed the very concept of operational endurance. Armies that rely on the predictability of industrial logistics are shackled by their assumptions. Armies that eat, sleep, and survive within the land itself become free. The land is no longer just terrain, it is theater, arsenal, and ally. And the realization is simple, chilling, and elegant. To control your sustenance is to control your opponent's mind, long before a shot is fired, long before a perimeter is breached, long before the first casualty falls. The first rule of jungle survival is simple, and it tastes like nothing you've ever known. You eat what the earth offers, whether it courts your appetite or assaults it. For most Western soldiers, this principle arrives as a gut punch of disbelief. Field manuals, captured from Australian, Southeast Asian, and allied Pacific units, are blunt. Insects provide protein, grubs provide fat, snakes are meat if you can strip them clean, and nothing goes to waste. The text itself is clinical, but the reality is visceral. Reading it is one thing, feeling the wet, cold texture of a freshly dug grub in your palm, the slow wriggle under your thumb, is another entirely. Smell seeps into your gloves, into your uniform, into your consciousness. You eat not because it is pleasant, but because it is survival, and because eating, as these soldiers discovered, confers mobility the ration-bound cannot match. The Australian Field Manual, innocuous in its notebook form, describes step-by-step how to extract protein from beetles and grasshoppers. Hands scrape shells, pinch exoskeletons, squeeze glands, and the manual's tone is detached, almost antiseptic. Crush thorax, remove wings, cook in minimal heat. Veteran testimonies insist the reality was messier. Beetle intestines spilled across fingers, wing casings caught under fingernails. The smell of charred exoskeletons combined with sweat and wet earth made the air thick, almost unbreathable. Yet after 20 minutes, hunger drove it down. The flavor was secondary, the body's endurance first. It is an assault on civilized expectation, a battlefield education in disgust refined into a tactical edge. Reptiles, particularly snakes and lizards, presented a similar challenge. A patrol might catch a small python or a monitor lizard, its scales glinting in filtered sunlight through the canopy. Preparation required immediacy, kill, gut, and clean before rigor mortis stiffened the limbs. Blood flowed into the mud, and the smell of iron saturated the air. Some soldiers drank it straight, stirring the warm viscera into a soup, a ritual described in manuals under the term blood sustenance, intended to preserve minerals and stave off exhaustion. Others boiled meat in bamboo, wrapping it in leaves, infusing flavor and nutrition while masking the tang of raw iron and bile. The jungle demanded efficiency, hesitation meant hunger, and hunger was a far deadlier opponent than any rifle. Edible grubs and larvae were catalogued with almost surgical precision. Field guides labeled each species with size, seasonality, and caloric yield. Troops learned to extract them without crushing, to pluck them from decomposing wood or beneath leaf litter. There is a rhythm to it. Roll the bark with a stick, pry the grubs free, flick off the remnants of soil, and consume. Textures ranged from slimy to crunchy. The smell oscillated from earthy to rank. Soldiers described the first few attempts as nauseating, but repetition erased hesitation. The body adapts, the mind recalibrates, and what once invoked disgust becomes ordinary, even comforting, a reliable source of energy when every calorie counts. Rice paddies and stagnant waters introduced another layer of consumption, fauna that other soldiers would flee. Frogs, tadpoles, small fish, water insects, even the occasional eel or mud crab, all became part of the diet. Patrols worked silently among the reeds, trapping creatures with improvised nets or snaring with sharp sticks. The field manuals emphasized hygiene as best possible under conditions, but in practice, hygiene bowed to necessity. Taste, like pleasure, was secondary, efficiency was paramount. To refuse was to risk collapse mid-patrol, unable to traverse terrain already hostile to the unprepared. Fermentation became a tactical tool as well. Soldiers would bury tubers or rice in leaf-lined pits, allowing natural microbial processes to break down starches and protein. The result was pungent, sour, almost violent in aroma. When mixed with foraged grubs or small reptiles, it created a survival ration dense in calories and minerals, indigestible in polite kitchens, but life-saving in the field. Manuals describe it clinically. Substrate decomposition allowed for extended nutrient extraction. But in practice, the smell clung to skin, hair, and clothing, a constant reminder that comfort had been abandoned in favor of mobility and endurance. Perhaps most striking was the utilization of entrails, organs, and parts of game Western soldiers habitually discarded. Liver, heart, and intestines were not delicacies but necessity. They were high-calorie, mineral-rich, and could be consumed raw, boiled, or roasted over minimal heat. One veteran recalled boiling a small marsupial's innards in a bamboo tube, the steam carrying a metallic tang that turned stomachs, yet energized the men for another 10 kilometers of dense jungle. The practice, taught officially, was terrifying to newcomers, yet became ritualistic. The jungle dictated what was edible, the manual codified the process, and the soldiers obeyed with pragmatic horror. The tactical edge was undeniable. Allied units waiting for resupply helicopters or ration drops remained tethered, their movements dictated by logistics. Australian patrols, by contrast, were unshackled. They moved continuously, traversed greater distances, and struck when the enemy believed they were resting. The act of consuming the environment, literally converting the land into calories, was an operational multiplier. Each step taken, each day survived without resupply, expanded their reach and reduced predictability. Hunger was no longer a limiting factor. The jungle itself had become the provider, the manual, the guide, and the patrol, a relentless, self-sufficient vector of mobility. Attempts to teach this methodology to Allied forces produced predictable dissonance. Manuals were handed out, demonstrations staged, yet cultural and psychological barriers proved formidable. Soldiers accustomed to packaged rations balked at grubs, recoiled at entrails, and treated fermented pit foods with revulsion. Field instructors tried persistence, emphasizing efficiency and operational freedom, but disgust slowed adoption. Some learned through necessity, the immediacy of hunger overriding instinct. Others refused, falling back on supply chains that would eventually, and sometimes fatally, constrain their operational range. The tactical lesson remained. Disgust was training, endurance, both physical and mental, was operational. What emerges from these accounts is a form of warfare in which civilization itself was a liability. Eating the land was not eccentricity, it was mastery. Soldiers who could override instinct, who could navigate nausea and cultural revulsion, gained a form of independence that allowed patrols to move farther, strike faster, and survive where others could not. The manuals codified procedures that seemed grotesque in peacetime, yet in combat, every disgusting bite was a calculus of survival, mobility, and tactical advantage. By the end of a 3-week patrol, soldiers carried with them the weight of this education. Hands smelled faintly of earth and iron, stomachs adapted to textures once intolerable, and minds recalibrated their notions of food, comfort, and control. They had become human instruments of endurance, capable of sustained operations in conditions that would immobilize others. Every insect crushed, every intestine boiled, every pit-fermented ration consumed reinforced an operational truth. The jungle could not starve them, and the enemy could not predict them. Survival had become performance, disgust, discipline, and every bite a statement of tactical sovereignty. The final revelation is chilling. A force that can consume the land is untethered, unpredictable, and self-sustaining. While Western armies lingered on airdropped rations, waiting for provision and reprieve, these soldiers moved as vectors of persistent threat, converting disgust into efficiency, horror into capability, and the simple act of eating into a weapon of continuous warfare. And when the manuals were studied, copied, and sometimes mocked, the truth lingered. Those who embraced the field's full horror survived longer, moved faster, and dominated in a terrain that would have devoured the unprepared. Hunger, in their hands, became more than survival, it became strategy. The first sign of failure wasn't tactical, it was physical. Men vomited in the tree line, knees buckling, hands shaking, bile mixing with red dust and leaf rot, not from enemy contact, from lunch. The training camps were meant to be bridges, places where allies would learn how to move the way the jungle demanded, not the way supply chains preferred. American advisors in Korea, Australian units rotating through Vietnam, British forces lingering from Malaya, all brought together with a single, uncomfortable lesson: if the land feeds the enemy, it can feed you if you let it. Most couldn't. The curriculum was blunt: no resupply for days, no packaged rations. What you carried in was what you found: roots pulled from riverbanks, grubs cracked open with thumbnails, rice scavenged from abandoned paddies, protein trapped, skinned, cooked over heat so low it barely smoked. It wasn't starvation training, it was denial training, learning to operate where the enemy assumed you would weaken. The reaction was immediate and telling. Some soldiers tried, they gagged, swallowed, gagged again, others flatly refused. Requests for medical evaluations spiked within 48 hours, stomach cramps, dizziness, nutritional stress. Medics logged symptoms that mirrored withdrawal more than illness. A few men hoarded emergency rations, burying them in packs, eating in secret at night. When discovered, they argued necessity. When punished, they asked for transfers. Commanders watched the cohesion fray. The problem wasn't calories, it was culture. Western militaries had been raised on certainty, 3 meals, predictable intake, food as morale. Eating was a scheduled act, not a tactical one. The idea that sustenance could be opportunistic, unclean, unmeasured, offended more than the stomach. It challenged identity. Soldiers weren't supposed to live like this. That was the unspoken line. Enemy forces never drew it. Viet Cong units moved through zones Allied planners marked as starved out, areas bombed, stripped, defoliated. Intelligence reports assumed deprivation, but the enemy didn't read those reports. They ate insects that survived Agent Orange. They harvested tubers that grew beneath craters. They fished drainage ditches at night. What looked barren to a logistician looked sufficient to a man taught from childhood to extract calories from almost anything. In Korea, U.S. advisors observed North Korean patrols operating for weeks beyond assumed endurance limits. The explanation wasn't supernatural discipline, it was a diet: pine bark flour, grass soups, rodents, food not as comfort but as fuel. Attempts were made to close the gap, briefly, optimistically. Joint exercises forced Allied units into the same conditions. The results were embarrassing. Patrol ranges shrank, movement slowed, decision-making degraded, not because men were weak, but because they were hungry in a way they'd never experienced. Hunger that didn't end with a resupply convoy. Reports from Vietnam noted a pattern. Allied patrols required predictable extraction windows tied to food. Enemy units did not. This asymmetry created freedom of movement. One side planned around eating, the other ate around planning. The institutional response wasn't reform, it was a retreat. After repeated failures, integration attempts were quietly scaled back. Survival blocks were shortened. Foraging was reframed as emergency only. The doctrine shifted language from land-based sustainment to last resort subsistence. The implication was clear: this wasn't how Western soldiers should operate. An internal British report from the Malayan emergency admitted the limitation with surprising candor. It stated that European troops could not maintain prolonged operations in jungle territory without external supply, and that forcing adaptation risked morale collapse. The recommendation wasn't harsher training, it was better logistics. The Americans came to the same conclusion. Rather than change the soldier, they changed the system. Airlift expanded. Ration technology improved. Helicopters became kitchens in the sky. The answer to environmental denial was technological abundance. It worked until it didn't. Every supply chain created predictability. Every predictable route created ambush. The enemy learned to read hunger into schedules, to anticipate movement based on when Western units needed to eat. Food became intelligence. Meanwhile, enemy forces moved invisibly through empty spaces. They weren't empty, they were simply unreadable to outsiders. There were moments of clarity. Advisors who watched local fighters eat what their own men wouldn't touch. Officers who noted that the land wasn't hostile, it was selective. But those observations rarely survived staff review. They implied that the limitation wasn't equipment, it was a mindset. And mindsets are harder to requisition. By the late stages of these conflicts, the admission was implicit but absolute. Allied forces could not operate with the same freedom of movement in the same terrain because they refused to eat the same way. Not couldn't, refused. That refusal carried a cost. It narrowed operational windows. It tied presence to supply. It made absence impossible. And absence, in guerrilla war, is vulnerability. The training camps closed. The vomiting stopped. The reports were filed. Western militaries returned to what they did best, bringing the world with them when they went to war. The enemy stayed light and fed. The jungle didn't choose sides. It offered calories to anyone willing to accept them. Only one side consistently did. The siege didn't begin with artillery. It began with accounting. French officers sat under canvas, pencils scratching against paper, calculating calories the way other men count ammunition. How many tons could be flown in? How many mouths had to be fed? How long discipline could outrun hunger? On the valley floor of Dien Bien Phu, war was reduced to logistics, and logistics promised victory. Because starvation was supposed to be inevitable. The French position looked strong on paper. A fortified bowl, ringed with artillery, supplied by air, runways carved into mud, paratroopers, legionnaires, colonial troops, men with boots, rations, doctrine. They believed that if they held long enough, the enemy would break. No army could sustain itself in those mountains without supply lines. No force could eat air. The Vietnamese proved them wrong by eating the land. At first the enemy was invisible. No massed formations, no dramatic assaults, just pressure, trenches inching closer each night, dug by hand, by shovel, by bare fingers when tools broke. The sound carried differently at night, soft scraping, muffled voices, the wet pull of earth being moved. French sentries fired into darkness and hit nothing. They were fighting an enemy that didn't need to rush. While the French rationed, the Viet Minh dispersed. Small units melted into the hills, living off roots, leaves, insects, and rice carried in sacks on backs instead of trucks. Women and children hauled supplies through jungle trails that aircraft couldn't see and artillery couldn't reach. Every calorie mattered, but it didn't have to look like a meal. Snails, bamboo shoots, bitter greens that tore the stomach until the body learned. Proteins scraped from rivers with nets woven by hand. It wasn't romantic. It was survival refined into doctrine. Inside the French perimeter, hunger arrived on schedule. Rations shrank as airstrips cratered under bombardment. Parachute drops drifted into enemy hands or smashed into mud. What arrived often rotted before it could be distributed. Men traded cigarettes for extra biscuits. Officers pretended not to notice. Discipline frayed quietly. The contrast sharpened daily. French patrols moved less, conserving energy. Viet Minh units moved more because movement was how they ate. A patrol wasn't just reconnaissance, it was foraging. A halt wasn't rest, it was a chance to dig, plant, hide, prepare. The land wasn't terrain, it was storage. Artillery thundered from the hills, shells dragged up piece by men who weighed less than the guns they moved. French counter-battery fire answered, powerful and precise, but it never stopped the flow. Destroy one gun, another appeared. Kill one porter, three more stepped forward. The French kept calculating. They measured the enemy in tonnage destroyed, positions taken, casualties inflicted. The numbers looked good. They always did, but none of it translated into collapse. The Viet Minh never surged forward in desperation. They never rushed the wire in hunger-fueled panic. They waited. Waiting cost them nothing. By the third month, the French understood the problem but couldn't solve it. Their entire operational logic depended on deprivation as a weapon. Starve the enemy, force engagement, win decisively. But the enemy wasn't dependent on what the French considered food. They had stepped outside the equation. Captured fighters told the story without drama. They spoke of eating things that made interrogators recoil. Things pulled from mud, bark scraped from trees, animals too small to bother naming. Their bodies were lean, scarred, and functional. They weren't thriving, but they weren't breaking. Inside the French lines, men dreamed of bread. The smell of cooking, real cooking, became torture. A can heated too long, a stew that burned because no one had the energy to stir it. Hunger sharpened everything, pain, fear, resentment. Firepower remained, but the will to use it bled away one missed meal at a time. The siege tightened. Positions fell not because they were overrun, but because the men inside them couldn't hold on anymore. A bunker abandoned quietly in the night. A trench left unmanned because no one could climb back into it. Each loss made the perimeter smaller, the hunger louder. French commanders began to talk about extraction. The Viet Minh talked about tomorrow. When the final assaults came, they were almost anticlimactic. Not waves of bodies, but steady pressure against men who had already lost the argument with their own stomachs. Resistance collapsed unevenly. Some units fought hard to the end, others simply stopped. The body has a vote, and hunger always wins it. After the surrender, the truth emerged in reports no one wanted to write. The battle hadn't been lost to superior weapons. It hadn't even been lost to numbers. It had been lost to an enemy whose logistic system was the jungle itself. Post-war analysis admitted what commanders wouldn't say out loud at the time. We could not starve them out because they were never dependent on what we considered food. The same lesson echoed elsewhere, across decades and continents. In Vietnam again, years later, American units poured firepower into tunnel networks that refused to die. Bombs collapsed entrances, chemicals flooded chambers, yet fighters resurfaced, thinner but operational, sustained by underground farms, hidden caches, and diets that bore no resemblance to rations in a mess hall. The tunnels weren't just fortifications, they were pantries. In Korea's mountains, guerrillas slipped through UN sweeps that assumed winter would finish what bullets didn't. They ate pine bark, boiled grasses, and chewed leather until it softened. Units that should have frozen or starved simply didn't. They reappeared when the snow melted, still armed, still organized. The emotional gut punch wasn't that these fighters suffered. Everyone suffered. It was that suffering didn't push them toward collapse. It was built in. For the conventional armies facing them, this created a slow, corrosive realization. You could bomb supply lines, but there were none. You could blockade roads, but food didn't move on roads. You could wait them out, but waiting favored the side that had already accepted hunger as normal. Doctrine met biology, and biology chose a winner. The soldiers who ate the land paid a price that doesn't show up in victory parades: damaged bodies, lifelong illness, teeth ruined, stomachs wrecked, years stolen. But strategically, their willingness to cross that line, to redefine what counted as sustenance, made them unstoppable. Firepower can destroy what it can see. Starvation can break what needs feeding. But against an enemy who redefines survival, those tools lose their edge. That is the quiet terror behind these sieges. Not the guns, not the explosions, but the realization that you are fighting someone whose floor is lower than yours. Someone who will keep going after you stop recognizing yourself. In the end, the land didn't just sustain them, it chose them. And the armies that couldn't eat it were forced, eventually, to leave it behind. The smell hit first, not rot, something earthier, damp soil, crushed leaves, smoke clinging to fabric. Allied patrol reports described it with a kind of recoiling fascination, as if proximity alone was contaminating. Enemy troops were living off the land, eating insects, roots, grubs pulled from rotting logs, and the reaction was immediate, visceral, and revealing, disgust masquerading as analysis, judgment standing in for understanding. Official language hardened quickly. Field intelligence summaries and internal correspondence reached for the same words again and again: savage, primitive, uncivilized. Diaries echoed it more bluntly. Men wrote about opponents who ate like animals, who didn't know real food, who survived because they had no standards. The implication was clear. This wasn't just a different method. It was evidence of inferiority, a cultural flaw mistaken for a tactical one. But that framing only emerged after something else became undeniable. The enemy was outlasting them. Patrols expected to starve opponents into collapse instead found units that didn't need supply lines. Campaigns designed around cutting logistics ran headlong into fighters who had quietly eliminated logistics altogether. The jungle, the mountains, the margins, these weren't obstacles, they were pantries. Rather than confront that failure head-on, Allied forces often reached for a psychological escape hatch. If the enemy's method was framed as barbaric, then losing to it wasn't a failure of doctrine. It was an aberration, a temporary embarrassment inflicted by people who didn't play by civilized rules. Disgust became a shield. Cultural superiority became insulation against institutional self-critique. Propaganda amplified it. Posters and briefings emphasized cleanliness, order, proper rations. The enemy was depicted as filthy, animalistic, barely human, not just dangerous but repulsive. That framing did double duty. It dehumanized the opponent and reassured the home front that any setback wasn't a sign of weakness, just proof of what they were up against. Savages don't win because they're better. They win because they're willing to be disgusting. The irony sat in plain sight. Those same savage practices were delivering measurable results. Units survived weeks longer, moved faster, required fewer resupply drops, operated deeper and quieter. The numbers told an uncomfortable story: fewer medical evacuations due to malnutrition, lower logistical signatures, sustained operational tempo in terrain designed to break outsiders. But numbers don't always beat narratives, especially when narratives protect identity. There's a passage in one soldier's journal that captures the contradiction perfectly. He describes watching an enemy patrol strip bark from a tree, chew it, and move on. He calls it revolting. Then, 2 pages later, he notes that his own unit is pulling back early due to ration shortages. The connection is never made explicit. The disgust blocks it. What's rarely acknowledged is how deeply racial hierarchy shaped that response. Eating the land wasn't just seen as desperate. It was framed as something only those people would do. Cultural practices rooted in indigenous knowledge were dismissed as evidence of backwardness, even as they repeatedly outperformed imported Western systems. To admit otherwise would have required a far more destabilizing conclusion: that those deemed inferior had mastered something the so-called modern military had not. Disgust, in that sense, wasn't about hygiene. It was about refusal. Refusal to acknowledge that superiority in firepower and organization didn't automatically translate to superiority in survival. Refusal to believe that doctrine developed in temperate, industrialized societies might fail spectacularly elsewhere. Refusal to learn from people already written off. Legacy of that refusal is complicated and uncomfortable, because decades later, modern Western militaries quietly incorporated many of the same techniques. Survival schools now teach insect consumption, wild foraging, water sourcing from vines and soil. Manuals describe caloric yields of grubs and ants. Instructors demonstrate how to prepare them safely. The language has changed. It's no longer eating bugs. It's alternative protein sources. No longer primitive. Now it's pragmatic. The rebranding matters. By sanitizing the practice, the institution avoids confronting its own past prejudice. The knowledge is acceptable once stripped of its cultural origin, taught in controlled environments, framed as emergency measures rather than lifestyle. The same act, divorced from the people who perfected it, becomes respectable. That gap raises an uncomfortable question. If the practice works, if it always worked, what was the disgust really about? Food is food when survival is on the line. Calories don't care about race or doctrine. The revulsion wasn't biological. It was ideological. A boundary drawn to protect a worldview where power and sophistication flowed in only one direction. Acknowledging that truth doesn't diminish allied courage or sacrifice. It complicates it. It forces a reckoning with how often cultural bias distorts military judgment. How often failure is explained away instead of examined. How often lessons are delayed because learning them would require humility. The enemy wasn't winning because they were uncivilized. They were surviving because they understood their environment intimately and without shame. They didn't romanticize hardship, but they didn't recoil from it either. That difference mattered. It still does. Today, those same techniques are taught behind closed doors, stripped of context, repackaged as advanced skills. The irony lingers. What was once mocked as proof of inferiority is now praised as elite adaptability. The disgust has faded, but the question remains unresolved. Was it ever really about the food? Or was it about the far more threatening idea that the people deemed lesser had figured out how to endure and win on their own terms? The first thing to fail in a modern war won't be courage or technology, it will be logistics. And when that breaks, what happens next is something most modern armies would rather not imagine. In planning rooms, the maps are clean. Arrows leap across oceans. Timelines assume fuel arrives, rations flow, resupply flights land on schedule. But in every serious peer conflict exercise, the same moment arrives like a quiet alarm. The ships don't make it. The airspace is dennied. The ports are cratered. The supply chain, the invisible spine of modern warfare, snaps. And suddenly, units forward of the fight are alone with what they carried and what the land is willing to give. This is the dirty secret of modern preparation, the part rarely shown in glossy briefings because it sounds like going backward. In the Pacific, U.S. Marine Corps planners talk about island chains and expeditionary advanced bases, small units inserted onto austere terrain, operating inside an adversary's weapons envelope, expected to persist. The language is antiseptic, distributed lethality, stand-in forces, but beneath the euphemisms lies a harder reality. These Marines are being trained to live without reliable resupply, to move when ships can't reach them, to stay when extraction isn't guaranteed. And that means eating the land again. In Arctic doctrine, the problem sharpens. Cold kills batteries, fuel gels, aircraft struggle. A single missed resupply window can mean starvation. Units training above the Arctic Circle learn quickly that packaged rations are temporary comfort. Weight matters, volume matters. Once those run out, survival becomes local. Fish pulled from ice holes, small game trapped in silence, fat rendered for calories because protein alone won't keep you alive in cold. This isn't nostalgia, it's math. Dennied area operations assume the enemy will target logistics first because it's easier than targeting soldiers. Satellites see convoys, missiles love ports, cyber attacks stall inventory systems. The more advanced the force, the more brittle its supply chain becomes, and brittleness creates opportunity for the side willing to endure discomfort the other refuses. That lesson is being relearned quietly, often uncomfortably. In special operations schools across Western militaries, survival training has taken a turn that would have horrified many WWII veterans who once mocked it. Students are taught to harvest insects deliberately, not as desperation, but as planning. Grubs split open for fat. Ants are roasted briefly to kill parasites. Protein is measured not in taste, but in efficiency. Field butchery is drilled with clinical precision, how to take an animal down quickly, silently, how to use every part, how to leave nothing that signals human presence. The smells linger, blood in soil, smoke from tiny fires hidden under the canopy. The discomfort is constant. Hunger sharpens attention but erodes patience. Students gag not because they're weak, but because modern culture has trained them to see disgust as failure. Instructors don't rush them, they wait, because the lesson isn't about nutrition, it's acceptance. What once revolted soldiers is now reframed as capability, indigenous resource utilization, austere environment sustainment. The words change, but the act is the same. Take calories where you find them, stay mobile, refuse dependence. The contrast with logistics-heavy forces is stark. A unit tied to resupply schedules plans around protection of routes. It pauses when fuel runs low. It clusters when food arrives. Each pause creates a signature. Each signature is a target. Meanwhile, a force that eats the land moves when it wants. It bypasses roads. It lingers where sensors expect absence. Freedom of movement isn't granted by speed or armor, it's granted by independence. There is a psychological price. Soldiers raised on predictability struggle at first. The body rebels, morale dips. Hunger changes perception, time stretches, the mind fixates. But something else happens too. Dependence fades. Confidence grows, not the loud kind, but the quiet knowledge that survival isn't fragile. That movement doesn't require permission from a supply officer hundreds of miles away. This is why the doctrine is returning now, under pressure rather than preference. Peer adversaries won't fight fair. They won't allow uncontested logistics. They will attack sustainment first because it collapses everything else. The side that can operate longest without a tether gains not just endurance, but initiative. Numerically, the advantage compounds. A unit that doesn't require daily resupply reduces exposure events dramatically. Fewer flights, fewer convoys, fewer chances to be seen. One less dependency equals one less vulnerability. The equation is simple and merciless. Institutionally, this is uncomfortable to admit. Modern militaries pride themselves on efficiency, on supply mastery, on technological elegance. Teaching soldiers to eat insects feels like regression. It clashes with identity. And yet, doctrine bends when reality applies pressure, not publicly, not proudly, but steadily. The human layer remains. Eating the land strips away comfort and illusion. It forces soldiers to confront a truth older than uniforms, that survival precedes strategy. That war, at its most basic, is about staying alive long enough to matter. This knowledge humbles, it also hardens. In training areas today, Western Special Forces students kneel in the dirt, hands sticky, faces tight with reluctance. They chew because they must, not because they want to. Instructors watch without comment. Somewhere in the background, a drone hums, reminding everyone why this matters. Because in the next war, resupply may never come. Because the land doesn't care about doctrine, only about adaptation. This is the full-circle irony. What one generation rejected as primitive is now taught as foresight. What disgusted soldiers once laughed at is now written into manuals under new names. The battlefield has caught up to the lesson. In the end, the side willing to eat the land will move when others stall. It will wait where others withdraw. It will survive where others calculate risk and decide the cost is too high. And in a war where supply chains are targets and comfort is a vulnerability, that willingness becomes decisive. Disgust, it turns out, is a luxury, and modern war can't afford it.